The Temple Mount is in our hands. I repeat, the Temple Mount is in our hands. Those were perhaps the most important words uttered for the Jewish people in the last 2,000 years. This hallowed real estate happens to be the place where Jerusalem's great sacred shrine once stood, prior to its destruction by the Romans on the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. All that remains is the massive limestone retaining wall surrounding the enormous artificial plateau on which the temple rested. The Western Wall, or Kotel HaMa'aravi in Hebrew, is for Jews the holiest site on earth. For 2 millennia, pious Jewish pilgrims have flocked here to pray and to kiss the ancient ashlars. Yet, in 1948, when Israel at last became an independent nation, the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem's old city, including the wall, fell to the Arabs. Jewish and Arab forces clashed during Israel's War of Independence, which broke out in May of that year. Inside the Ottoman Turkish walls of the old city, the so-called Jewish quarter had been home to a substantial population of observant Jews since ancient times. Now, however, they found themselves surrounded and cut off by Jordan's Arab Legion, with no hope of escape. Meet Uzi Narkis, a native-born Jerusalemite whose parents had immigrated from Poland. His earliest childhood recollection was hiding in the city during the Arab riots of 1929. He joined the elite Jewish fighting force, the Palmach, when he was just 16 years old, and now he found himself tasked with relieving the beleaguered Jewish population trapped in the old city. He and his men literally blew the hinges off the fabled old Zion Gate. His troops evacuated the wounded and shuttled in supplies in a desperate attempt to hold the Jewish quarter. But when reinforcements failed to materialize, his only recourse was to abandon the old city to the Arab forces. The Jewish quarter was ransacked, looted, and virtually leveled to the ground. The great Horva synagogue, a landmark of Jewish Jerusalem for centuries, was dynamited and completely destroyed. Still, Narkis rescued the Jewish population and prevented what would surely have been a massacre. To this day, the scarred and pitted Zion Gate bears the shrapnel marks of those fateful and heroic days. Fast forward to the year 1967. The state of Israel was 1 year shy of 20 years old. The fledgling state had already faced the daunting challenge of absorbing a massive influx of Jewish refugees from Europe, including many displaced persons from camps following World War II and from Muslim lands. These new immigrants were mostly unskilled and very poor, yet Israel found a way to give them temporary shelter and employment. Now, however, tensions in the region were escalating as the Soviet Union propped up Israel's Arab enemies. Syria was actively shelling Israeli border villages in the Golan Heights, and Syrian infiltrators increased their attacks. Egypt insisted on the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping force and blockaded the Straits of Tiran, Israel's only access to its Red Sea port of Eilat. Negotiations went nowhere. Israel's response was to launch a preemptive strike on Egypt, destroying its air force on the ground and gaining complete air superiority in the ongoing conflict. A similar Israeli air assault incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. In the first 3 days of the conflict, Israel secured a decisive victory, seizing from Egypt all of the territory up to the Suez Canal, including the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip to the north. On June 5th, 1967, Jordan opened fire on Jewish Jerusalem, comprising the western half of the city. King Hussein was now fully engaged in the war. It was time for Uzi Narkis to get back into the action, commanding 7 brigades. Having evacuated the Jewish quarter nearly 2 decades before, the same Uzi Narkis was now in position to retake it and capture the entire old city. The attack, launched on June 7th, was quick and efficient. Colonel Mota Gur took up position on the Mount of Olives overlooking the Temple Mount from the east. Over a loudspeaker, he announced, "All company commanders, we're sitting right now on the ridge and we're seeing the old city. Shortly, we're going to go into the old city of Jerusalem that all generations have dreamed about. We will be the first to enter the old city. Eitan's tanks will advance on the left and will enter the Lion's Gate. The final rendezvous will be on the open square above." In short order, Narkis, along with Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin, came through the famed Lion's Gate. Journalist Yossi Ronen, embedded with the troops, described it in real time. "We can see the stone walls. They're still shooting at us. The Israeli tanks are at the entrance to the old city, and ahead we go, through the Lion's Gate. I'm with the first unit to break through into the old city. There is a Jordanian bus next to me, totally burnt. It is very hot here. We're about to enter the old city itself. We're standing below the Lion's Gate. The gate is about to come crashing down, probably because of the previous shelling. Soldiers are taking cover next to the palm trees. I'm also staying close to one of the trees. We're getting further and further into the city." Suddenly, on a walkie-talkie, Mota Gur's voice was heard, making a breathless declaration that would resound across the entire Jewish world. "The Temple Mount is in our hands. I repeat, the Temple Mount is in our hands." Israeli command responded over the wireless. "Comb the area. Discover the source of the firing. Protect every building in every way. Do not touch anything, especially in the holy places." Uzi Narkis wanted to know, "Where is the Western Wall? How do we get there?" In short order, he and a crowd of soldiers were standing in front of the ancient stones, some weeping, some reciting the Shehechianu blessing. Brigadier General Shlomo Goren, later to become the chief rabbi of Israel, recited another blessing, "Baruch atah Hashem menachem Tzion uvonei Yerushalayim." Blessed are you who comforts Zion and builds Jerusalem. He went on to recite a prayer for the fallen soldiers, El Malei Rachamim, and as the soldiers wept, he sounded the shofar. Finally, he declared, "Leshana hazot b'Yerushalayim habnuya, b'Yerushalayim ha'atika." This year, in a rebuilt Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem of old. On that same day, the UN called for a ceasefire, to which Israel and Jordan immediately agreed. Egypt accepted it the next day, but Syria continued to fight, shelling Israel's vulnerable Galilean villages. Israel responded with a tank assault into the hilly and mountainous terrain to the east of the Sea of Galilee, known as the Golan Heights. After a single day of pitched battle, the region was taken by the Israelis. On June 10th, Syria accepted the ceasefire. Just prior to the Six-Day War, Israel's most celebrated songstress, Naomi Shemer, had composed her beloved melodic masterpiece, Jerusalem of Gold. One of the song's verses reads, "We cannot go down to the Dead Sea by the way of Jericho." In fact, Israeli Jews were not able to visit the city made famous by Joshua or venture to any other destination in the biblical heartland. But the events of June of that year changed everything. In 6 days, Judea and Samaria, along with East Jerusalem, fell to Israel. The reality of that moment was almost beyond belief, and the lament Naomi Shemer had just completed suddenly seemed out of place and inappropriate. Hastily, she composed a final verse, adding the words, "And again we go down to the Dead Sea by the way of Jericho." Shemer's mournful melody had become a song of celebration. The feeling across the state of Israel was euphoric. Jerusalem of gold was now a united city. The wall was back in Jewish hands for the first time in 2,000 years. Many of Israel's sons had fallen in the conflict, but the triumphant sound of the shofar was heard again, echoing across the hallowed and weathered stones.